you're a working person, you've no doubt experienced the sensation of being a cog in a machine at some point. The feeling of detachment and disconnection in your daily life. Living for the weekend because the majority of your life is spent toiling for your capitalist overlord. Barely making enough to scrape by while your boss grows rich off the back of your labour. The little time you can find outside of work is your only opportunity to truly live. Marx summed this up in 1844 when he wrote that the worker only feels himself outside his work, and in his work he feels outside himself. He feels at home when he's not working, and when he is working he does not feel at home. His labour is therefore not voluntary but coerced. It is forced labour. As a result, therefore, man, the worker, only feels himself freely active in his animal functions, eating, drinking, procreating, or at most in his dwelling and in dressing up, etc. And in his human functions at work, he no longer feels himself to be anything but an animal. Here Marx is referring to the concept of alienation or estrangement, a point that hits hard for a lot of working people who experience this sensation of being chewed up and spit out day after day by the capitalist system that we're living under. It's also a topic that's been heavily debated among Marxists for reasons that will become clear later on in the video. So, what is alienation? What are workers alienated from exactly? And why is this a subject of such intense, heated debate among Marxists? Let's find out. Welcome to Socialism 101, a series designed to help educate people with no prior knowledge on the basics of socialism and communism from an ML and MLM perspective with short and easily digestible videos. If this sounds interesting to you, then go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell below. If you'd like to support Marxist educational content, then toss €1 or $1 per month over on Patreon to help keep this series going. If you're not in a position to support financially, you can help out a lot by just sharing these videos around on social media. Now, when talking about alienation, this broadly refers to detachment, estrangement, or disconnection from something. Alienation has occurred in various ways under all class societies, including slave society and feudalism. But the young Karl Marx argued in his economic and philosophical manuscript of 1844 that alienation presents most intensely under the capitalist mode of production. And he claims that it occurs in four main ways. 1. Alienation from the product of labour. 2. Alienation from the act of production. 3. Alienation from humanity's species being. And 4. Alienation from other people. Let's take a look at each of these one by one. First, the worker and sells them to realise a profit, creating an immediate disconnection between the worker and the product of their labour. As labour power is purchased at a lower cost than the value that labour itself produces, the worker can never afford to purchase all the products that they have created back from the capitalists. The products of labour are thus permanently detached or alienated from the worker who produced them. To demonstrate this, look at the clothes that you're wearing. Who made them? You likely don't know the workers who produced them, nor do the workers know you. The product of labour is detached or alienated from the worker who has produced it. Instead, you'll likely just see a brand of some kind, demonstrating the capitalist's appropriation of the product of the worker's labour and revealing that it's been detached or alienated from the workers themselves. Furthermore, the workers who create these clothes will never be able to purchase all these products that they've created. For example, workers in Bangladesh making 50 cents per hour would never be able to buy back all the high-end consumer goods that they're creating that are sold in the global north for hundreds of euros or dollars. Alienation from the product of labour is thus a permanent feature of the capitalist mode of production. Second, workers are alienated from the act of production itself insofar as the fact that workers don't freely engage in production of their own accord, but they instead labour in order to gain a wage so that they may survive. If they don't work, they can't afford food, shelter, clothing, or any of life's necessities. They consequently sell labour power to capitalists, not freely of their own accord, but are forced to do so as a result of economic coercion. In selling their labour power, workers' labour then belongs to someone else, the capitalists. The labour, the act of producing, becomes external to the worker. It's estranged or alienated. The external character of labour for the worker appears in the fact that it is not his own, but someone else's. That it does not belong to him. That in it he belongs not to himself, but to another. The worker's activity is not his spontaneous activity. It belongs to another. It is the loss of his self. Left to our own devices, we could engage in the kind of labour that we found most useful both individually and collectively, whether that be in producing art or helping to build homes for those in need. In Instead, we perform the labour demanded of us by capitalists who seek nothing more than the realisation of profit to the detriment of all else, determined by the whims of the market and the anarchy of production. So not only are workers alienated from the act of production under capitalism due to the economic coercion which forces them to sell their labour power, they're also alienated by what the capitalist forces them to produce, whether that's the shoes that are made in the sweatshop or the burger that's prepared in the restaurant. Neither are produced in accordance with the desires of the workers, but instead in accordance with the requirements of capital. As workers don't control the means of production, we find ourselves being controlled by the means of production, transformed into little more than an appendage of a larger process of production over which workers have no control. We become merely cogs in someone else's money-making machine. Third, in his early writings, Marx claims that workers are alienated from our species being or species essence. Marx suggested that there was a human essence that separated humans from other animals. The essence or spirit of humanity, humanity's species being, was that humans engage in labour and produce beyond our immediate needs, while other animals produce only what they need directly. Humans don't simply produce shelter and grow food. We also create art and write songs and make spaceships to send people to the moon. Marx explains that an animal only produces what it immediately needs for itself or its young. It produces one-sidedly, whilst man produces universally. An animal produces only under the dominion of immediate physical need, whilst man produces even when he is free from physical need and only truly produces in freedom therefrom. He suggested that this production that occurs beyond physical necessity is what allows people to transcend other animals and become truly human, to fully self-actualize. It is just in his work upon the objective world, therefore, that man really proves himself to be a species being. This production is his active species life. Through this production, nature appears as his work and his reality. The object of labour is, therefore, the objectification of man's species life, for he duplicates himself not only as in consciousness intellectually, but also actively in reality, and therefore he sees himself in a world that he has created. So if workers are unable to produce freely beyond physical necessity, they're detached or alienated from the defining feature of human nature itself, according to early Marx. Alienation from the product of labour and the act of production, as mentioned earlier, means workers are alienated from humanity and become no more than any other animals, robots, or simple cogs in a machine. Estranged labour, therefore, turns man's species being, both nature and his intellectual species power, into a being alien to him and a means of his individual existence. It estranges man from his own body, from nature as it exists inside him, from his spiritual essence, his human existence. Now, you may be surprised to hear Karl Marx writing about humanity's spiritual essence, particularly if you're more familiar with Marx's later writing, which has a much more detached, scientific, economically focused tone. Keep this point in mind. We're going to circle back to it after discussing the fourth type of alienation. Now, fourth, under the capitalist mode of production, workers are alienated from other workers, or more broadly, people are alienated from other people. Connecting this to the three previous forms of alienation already discussed, Marx writes that an immediate consequence of the fact that man is estranged from the product of his labour, from his life activity, from his species being, is the estrangement of man from man. When man confronts himself, he confronts the other man. What applies to a man's relation to his work, to the product of his labour, to himself, also holds of a man's relation to the other man and to the other man's labour and object of labour. However, alienation from other people is perhaps demonstrated a bit more concretely in Marx's later concept of commodity fetishism, which reveals the way in which the commodities that we encounter on the market mystify us and obscure the real human relations which are involved in the creation and distribution of these products. For example, it's generally impossible for us to know the workers in the sweatshops and the working conditions under which the products we encounter on the market have been created. The worker who produces the product is detached from it, and we as consumers purchase these detached products. This means that we as consumers are also detached or alienated from the workers themselves who produce them. Thus, the real social relations between people ourselves are hidden, and in its place appear to us merely relations between things, the money in our pocket and the product on the shelf. In this way, the capitalist mode of production makes us stands outside of history, detached from the objective material conditions of any given epoch. In fact, this contrast is so stark that Marx's work is often divided into pre-1845 early Marx and post-1845 late Marx. Early Marx is generally characterized as bearing heavy remnants from the left Hegelian tradition and dialectical idealism rather than dialectical materialism. Consequently, early Marx appears to harbor strong humanist sentiments that rely on some kind of essential human nature or inner spirit that exists outside of history, independent of material conditions. Conversely, late Marx is firmly rooted in the science of historical materialism that situates matter as the starting point for all that exists rather than spirit, breaking decisively from the remnants of bourgeois ideology that were present in early Marx's writing. The rupture from early Marxist humanism occurs specifically in the 1845 Theses of Feuerbach when Marx writes that Feuerbach resolves the religious essence into the human essence, but the human essence is no abstraction inherent in each single individual. In its reality, it is the ensemble of the social relations. Feuerbach, who does not enter upon a criticism of this real essence, is consequently compelled to abstract from the historical process and to fix the religious sentiment as something by itself and to presuppose an abstract, isolated human individual. Essence, therefore, can be comprehended only as genus, as an eternal dumb generality which naturally unites the many individuals. So, as we can see, Marx here breaks from his own concept of an abstract species being that he wrote so much about just 1 year prior in his economic and philosophical manuscripts, instead moving to understanding phenomena as developing dialectically as part of historical processes rooted in material conditions and social relations at all times. This was an epistemological break from the remnants of bourgeois idealism present in Marx's earlier writing, and marks a qualitative leap forward into the development of a truly proletarian ideology. So, where does this leave the concept of alienation when its basis on human species being is removed? Well, there may have been rupture from the idealist aspects of it, but there's also continuity. Marx returns to alienation in the Grundrisse in the late 1850s and speaks about it solely in the technical sense of detachment from the product of labour, the act of production, and from other people, where in his early writings he would connect each of these to a sense of disconnection from humanity's inner spirit. The concept of alienation is also present this way throughout Capital, though arguably in a de-emphasized form, operating behind the scenes while Marx discusses alienated commodities and commodity fetishism, alienation as it pertains to the working day, the way in which workers become the appendage of the productive process in their extremely specialized positions within the production line, and so on. So the concept of alienation clearly persists throughout Marx's later writing, but its humanist basis upon the species being, human nature, or inner spirituality is dropped in favor of a scientific, historical, materialistic basis. Today we've taken a look at Marx's concept of alienation under capitalism and how it developed over the course of his life's work. We began by looking at alienation from the product of labour, which persists throughout both early Marx and late Marx's writing. We proceeded to look at alienation from the act of production, which also persists. We then looked at alienation from species being, which is dropped from late Marx's writing following 1845's Theses on Feuerbach. And we then looked at alienation from others, connecting it to Marx's related concept of commodity fetishism. Lastly, we highlighted the development of the theory of alienation from its early idealist and humanistic basis upon species being, or human's inner spirituality, in texts like the philosophical and economic manuscripts of 1844, to its later materialist manifestation appearing in the Grundrisse, Capital, and other late Marx works both explicitly and implicitly. One more thing, the debate around alienation is largely divided along the lines of humanist Marxists and anti-humanist Marxists. For clarity's sake, I want to acknowledge that the form of alienation emphasized in this video would fall into the latter camp, rejecting idealist conceptions of spirit, species being, and so on. Consequently, the versions of alienation described here, despite using young Marxist categorizations, have been presented as more in line with positions maintained by late Marx, the Marx who wrote Capital, the Grundrisse, and so on, which don't rely on species being and instead focus primarily on the material realm. There's a reading and resources list in the description box below that I strongly recommend diving into if you're interested in learning about the different positions on alienation and the humanism versus anti-humanism divide. Make sure to have a read of Althusser's Marxism and Humanism from 1964 to clarify that rupture between early Marx and late Marx. If you're looking for podcasts and YouTube videos that dive into this further, Alison and Brett from the Red Menace podcast do an excellent job of making the case for these different positions on alienation in their episode on the philosophical and economic manuscripts of 1844. As does David Harvey in his podcast, The Anti-Capitalist Chronicles Alienation Part 1. And of course, the Marxist Projects video here on YouTube, The Fundamentals of Marx Alienation, all of which are linked in the description box below. Right, thanks very much for watching this video. Hopefully you found it useful in one way or another, even if you've now got more questions than you arrived with.
This is a guided meditation on peace, presentness, and political revolution. Find a place where you can sit comfortably, perhaps resting your hands on your knees. You may wish to sit on the floor with your legs crossed, or if you're not too tired, you may like to lie down on your back. Whatever position suits you. Make sure that your chest is open, and you may wish to allow your eyes to gently close, or find a point in the room where you can rest your focus. Begin by noticing your breathing. Feel your chest rising and falling, your belly expanding in and out. You don't have to change the way you breathe, just becoming aware of it. In and out. Notice also that society can be thought of as being made up of groups of people with conflicting and irreconcilable economic interests, which we call classes. You don't have to change society in this moment. This is your moment, your time. Just notice class conflict and be aware of it. This will be our anchor as we proceed on this journey. And now, let's take 3 deep, relaxing breaths. As you release the air in your lungs, you may wish to repeat in your mind the topics of today's meditation. And with each breath, I invite you to experience a doubling of your relaxation. Let's take the first of these 3 breaths. Now, breathing in, peace, and out. Very good. Breathing normally in between, becoming even more relaxed with each breath. Let's take the second breath. Now, in presentness and release. Fantastic job. Aware of your chest, rising and falling. Let's take the third and final breath. Now, breathing in, political revolution, and out. Well done. Don't worry if your breathing doesn't match the sound of my voice. It is all good, and it is all okay. Just becoming even more aware of breath, and beginning slowly to relax. As we breathed those 3 relaxing breaths, you may have noticed a slight tingling sensation spreading from the top of your head down through your shoulders, arms, chest, right out the tips of your toes. This sensation is available to you throughout this meditation, whenever you desire. As you sink deeper and deeper into this relaxed state of awareness, you may begin to notice the position of your body, the surfaces you are in contact with, the temperature of the room, and you may also notice your body's position in the system of global capitalism. And the air continues to flow, becoming even more relaxed, even more aware. Now, in this relaxed state, we are ready to consider the revolution. As you breathe in and out, receive an invitation to the idea that revolution will look different for you if you are in a bourgeois nation enriched by global capitalism than it might for someone in a country impoverished by it. Returning always to breath and class conflict. When we think about revolution, we may imagine it as destructive or violent. We may conjure images of past revolutions that we think fell short, or make jokes about sending landlords and capitalists to violent ends. We may shy away from this image, whether because we are liberals rather than socialists, or because we were raised in liberal capitalist societies that maintain a hold on our thoughts, or perhaps out of compassion and love for our fellow human beings, whoever they may be. Whatever the reason, we may desire to avoid revolution, but simply agitate for reform within capitalist society while maintaining its comforts. But although revolution means a break with the old ways of doing things, it need not be fundamentally destructive, but instead an act of creation. It may be scary or painful, like bringing a new child into the world, but it is the birthing of a new way of life, rather than the gradual managing of decay and bargaining with entropy that liberal democracy has become. This is not to say that we cannot learn from our mistakes or come to an understanding of history. Simply that, in considering the revolution, we want our focus to be on the present and not our anxieties about the past. Do not judge yourself if you have doubts. Simply observe them and let them go. We may become anxious or depressed when we ruminate on the past and witness the destruction and pain that can seem to surround us. We can be upset by the wickedness of others and wonder how it is that human beings can have done so many awful things to each other or the planet. Conversely, we may rejoice at small changes that we have managed to win in the past through elections and trade unions in the struggle for a fairer world. But the past is not real and exists only in our memories, in the present, where breath and class conflict remain. When we are not dwelling on the past, we often project our thoughts about revolution into the future, as if it will be some messianic event, waiting just out of reach, that will save us from the frightening things in our world. But the future also does not exist. It is only anticipation in the present moment. When we think of the revolution as a specific event, like an armed uprising that will take place in the future, we can become concerned about whether our actions take us closer to our idea of that event or farther away. We may become fixated on the purity of our vision, focusing only on the ideal, classless future, and neglecting other forms of oppression that others struggle against in the here and now. Or we may become anxious, thinking that it is an impossible task, or that we would have nothing to contribute, imagining instead that the future revolution will be led by anti-fascist catgirls or revolutionary daddies who will do the fighting for us. This can turn us against each other, or make us doubt ourselves, wondering whether what we or those around us are doing is truly revolutionary or merely reform. It is okay to have these doubts. Simply recognize them and return to the present moment, to breath, and the desire to abolish the class system. By noticing and letting go of doubts, and not judging ourselves or others for having them, we become prepared to take and wield power in the present, to neither retreat into ruminating on how we have been hurt in the past by the current political system, nor project our desire for change onto imaginary future heroes, but instead, in the present moment, to realize the energy inside of ourselves that we can use to lead the revolution. Now, breathing in presentness and out. When we look at the revolution either as a distant project of the future or the redemption of the past, we often imagine it as a moral crusade, springing from the best impulses of our hearts, and someday bringing about a lasting justice. But this way of thinking can also bind us and stop us from seeing the way forward in the present. It is easy to become overwhelmed or disappointed when our own sense of justice is not met, and to become concerned with how the resources of our world are distributed, rather than the conditions under which they are extracted and produced. We stray from the present and class conflict, and it is easy to conflate our moral desire for a better world with the ideals of participation in bourgeois democracies in which we are raised. That is not to say that we must abandon our moral ideals or close our hearts to democratic participation or the suffering of others, or that our smaller efforts to make the world a better place are necessarily a misuse of our time. to appreciate that a revolution is more than a change in the distribution of goods, or a struggle to get a slightly fairer deal. It is the struggle to abolish the causes of that injustice, not merely its symptoms, which are fleeting and can flare up chaotically as long as class conflict persists. Breathing in, political revolution, and out, aware of your chest, your belly, that tingling sensation in your head, shoulders, chest, and down through your legs. You may become aware that you are holding tension in your neck, or your jaw, or cognitive tension brought about by trying to reconcile the internal contradictions of capitalism. With your next breath, just invite any tense muscles to let go. In a moment, we will count backwards from 5 and gradually return to our normal awareness. But first, take a moment to suspend yourself in this relaxed state, as if deep in an ocean. The waves sway overhead, but you are still and calm. And now we will begin to surface with 5 short phrases. You may wish to repeat them in your mind or out loud, whatever is best for you. Beginning with 5. I am aware of my breath. And now, 4. I am aware of my body, becoming more aware with each breath. 3. I am aware of class conflict, breathing in and out with 2. I am aware of the revolutionary energy inside me. And now, finally, 1. I embrace revolution in the present moment. Fantastic job. If you wish, you can stay in this relaxed state for as long as you desire, or you may wish to continue your day renewed with this energy. Just remember to allow your awareness to always return to breath and the present moment, and the desire to abolish the class system. This meditation was written and performed by Althusser and recorded with the help of Manbros Media. Patreon.com/philosophytube is where you can support the show and find a list of the generous patrons who make it possible.
Whenever you say anything on the internet about Marx's ideas on human development, freedom, or alienation, someone asks the obvious question: what about the break between the early and the later Marx? Didn't Louis Althusser show that the true later Marx breaks completely with the young Marx's ideas? If we're proper Marxists, followers of the writings like the Communist Manifesto and Capital, why should we bother thinking about the ideas Marx had before he became the Marx who founded Marxism? This video looks at what Althusser actually said, what the differences between the early and the later Marx really are, and what they mean to us. Part 1. Introduction. The idea that Marx developed as a thinker over time was not entirely new with Althusser, of course. Anyone who had read Marx's schoolwork, his PhD thesis, or his early journalism cannot but notice that he changed his mind about things later on. Like every sensible person, as Marx learned more and reflected on what he learned, he changed his mind accordingly. This goes for the slightly later early work, to the more middle work as well, as Marx delved deeper into political economy. Lenin, for example, once wrote that Marx's first mature work was his critique of Proudhon, The Poverty of Philosophy. The notes that later got compiled into the book The German Ideology were at that time not available. And in many ways, Lenin was right here. Among other things, The Poverty of Philosophy is the first published work where Marx really focuses on political economy. With the rise of the Soviet Union and efforts to compile Marx's collected works, notebooks and drafts that had previously never seen the light of day began to appear. This includes now classic works like the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, the German Ideology, and the Grundrisse. These had a massive impact on Marx scholarship, often focusing on questions of human species being, alienation, and so on, which by some started to be used to criticize the later USSR. Often, these were used by so-called Marxist humanists, who argued that Marx's account of species being reveals a commitment to an unchanging and unalterable human essence, provides an ethical critique of capitalism, and so on. Althusser's early essays on the young versus late Marx are a kind of pushback against this sort of reading. He argues that there is what he calls an epistemological break, we'll talk about what that means later, between the young and the late Marx, and that only the later Marx is truly Marxist in a way that's relevant for us. For Althusser, it's only after shedding his liberal ideology and idealism that Marx takes up the science of history that forms the core of Marxism. As we will see, Althusser raises many points that we think are important to understand and that we agree with. Although we need to focus when we talk about Marx's ideas, we should never separate elements from each other so completely that we lose sight of the whole package. We shouldn't read the old Marx into the young Marx, where that doesn't make sense. We must emphasize the importance of Marx's development and change as a thinker. We were all born once, and, luckily, we change our ideas as we learn and think more about things. Althusser stresses that this is so for Marx as well, and we very much agree. To mention just a couple of examples, even after 1845, where Althusser locates the break between the early and late Marx, Marx changed his mind on his theories of political economy, on the revolutionary potential of the feudal peasantry, for instance in Russia, and on imperialism and colonialism, where he came to adopt a much more critical stance than he had earlier on. Finally, we agree that we must be careful not to confuse issues of terminology with issues of ideas. Changing the words that you use to express yourself obviously doesn't mean that you're necessarily changing your ideas. With these points of agreement in mind, let's look at what Althusser says. Part 2. What Althusser says. Althusser writes that we need to draw a line of demarcation between the true theoretical basis of the Marxist science of history and Marxist philosophy on the one hand, and, on the other, the pre-Marxist idealist notions on which depend contemporary interpretations of Marxism as a philosophy of man or a humanism. This division, Althusser writes, is situated essentially in the terrain of the confrontation between Marx's early works and Capital. In other words, his arguments are specifically trying to show that there is a major split, what he calls an epistemological break, between the allegedly idealist ideas of the early Marx and the properly materialist Marxist ideas we find in Capital. Here, volume 1 of Capital is the most important, because it's the only volume of Capital that Marx finished writing, finished publishing, and finished revising and republishing himself. Althusser locates the epistemological break in 1845 with the writing of the thesis on Feuerbach in particular. This break has two main components. First, the founding of Marx's theory of history, and second, the development of a new philosophy of dialectical materialism. In other words, for Althusser, the epistemological break is between a young Marx, who is essentially an idealist philosopher, and a mature Marx who's developed and embraced a certain philosophy and theory of history, what is often called dialectical and historical materialism. This in turn provides the basis for dividing Marx's work into four categories: the early works, the works of the break, the transitional works, and the mature works, where again Capital is the paradigmatic mature work. Now, there are a lot of nuances and details of Althusser's argument that we won't explore here, in part because he's responding to thinkers we haven't been discussing in this series and would end up distracting us too much from our main points. I mean, this could go on forever. The people Althusser is responding to have a very different reading of the early Marx than we do, and when they talk about things like Marx's theory of alienation, their interpretation differs quite a bit from ours. That's why we started by pointing out many points where we agree with Althusser, and these are some of the reasons why we also disagree with those people Althusser is responding to. What we will focus on instead is the interpretation of Marx's thoughts on human development and flourishing, freedom, alienation, and communism that we've discussed in our video series. We will see whether Althusser's arguments do anything to show that Marx changed his mind on these things as we understand them. We don't quite know what Althusser himself would think of our views. As we said, he was responding to some very different readings of the early Marx that we generally don't agree with. Why are we focusing on him then? Because almost all the people who insist on there being a split between the young and late Marx tend to refer back to Althusser's arguments. Since Althusser wasn't responding to quite our type of interpretation, we think it's a bit unfair to focus on him, but nobody we know seems to be able to find anyone better. So, what we're presenting here won't so much be a critique of Althusser, as it will be us showing that his arguments don't show that our interpretation of the later Marx is wrong. To see what Althusser's arguments actually are, let's begin with the three principles that Althusser offers for providing a Marxist theory of ideological development. His first principle we can call the principle of totality. Every ideology must be regarded as a real whole, internally unified by its own problematic, so that it is impossible to extract one element without altering its meaning. Instead of focusing on individual elements, or some individual person's particular claims and ideas in isolation, Althusser says we need to focus on an ideology as a whole that is held together by its own quote-unquote problematic that makes it the kind of ideology that it is. The second principle we can call the principle of material basis. The meaning of this whole, of a particular ideology, in this case an individual's thought, depends not on its relation to a truth other than itself, but on its relation to the existing ideological field and on the social problems and social relations which sustain the ideology and are reflected in it. The sense of the development of a particular ideology depends not on the relation of this development to its origins or its end, considered as its truth, but to the relation found within this development between the mutations of the particular ideology and the mutations in the ideological field, and the social problems and relations that sustain it. Put differently, every ideology is rooted in a material basis, the social relations and problems that it reflects and responds to. Althusser thinks that when we should try to understand how ideologies develop and change, we should not focus mostly on where the ideology arose out of or what it evolved into. Rather, we should first and foremost focus on the relations between the changes in the ideology and the changes in the social relations and problems that it is concerned with. From this follows a third principle. We can call this the principle of motive force. The developmental motor principle of a particular ideology cannot be found within ideology itself, but outside it. in what underlies the particular ideology, its author as a concrete individual, and the actual history reflected in this individual development according to the complex ties between the individual and this history. What Althusser is saying here is that the driving forces of any particular ideology aren't some of the elements of the ideology itself. Rather, they can only be found in the concrete, lived reality of the people who use and develop it and the social and historical processes they are part of. So, according to Althusser, what is the ideological structure of the early Marx? To be honest, that's a bit unclear, but roughly speaking, it seems to be that his early work and ideas share the same kind of anthropological problematic. Althusser seems to think that the early Marx looks at different things, the state, religion, and so on, through the lens of them being objects for humans into which humans project, alienate, and seek to reclaim their universal and ahistorical species being. This perspective, Althusser argues, is abandoned in the later Marx. The details are unclear, and Althusser changed his mind over time basically in response to more and more of Marx's notebooks coming out, and other writings being examined in more detail, revealing, as the previous videos in this series have mentioned, that Marx in fact uses many of his earlier concepts later on as well. Overall, Althusser argues that if you look at the whole of Marx's work, there is no doubt that there does exist a break of some kind in 1845. In 1845, Marx began to lay down the foundations of a science which did not exist before he came along, the science of history. And in order to do that, he set out a number of new concepts which cannot be found anywhere in his humanist works of youth. Mode of production, productive forces, relations of production, infrastructure, superstructure, ideologies, etc. No one can deny that. It is true that Marx several times uses the term alienation, but all this disappears in Marx's later texts and in Lenin, completely. We could therefore simply say, what is important is the tendency, and Marx's scientific work does tend to get rid of these philosophical categories. There's a lot here that we agree with. Certainly, many of the key ideas of what later gets called, Marx doesn't use these terms, dialectical and historical materialism, are things that Marx only really starts developing and using fully from 1845 onwards. There's also a marked shift towards studying political economy that starts in 1844, but really begins to take root from 1845 and 1846 onwards. Part 3. The evidence. The change in focus and emphasis that Althusser mentions, however, doesn't mean that Marx rejects all of his earlier ideas. This is why Althusser adds the aforementioned claim that the later Marx's work does tend to get rid of these philosophical categories. Althusser's main support for his reading was that certain key concepts in the earlier works, like alienation and the negation of the negation, never appear in Marx's mature works. This was quickly shown to be false. Both of these appear in later works, not only in his later notebooks, like the Guerrilla, but also in Capital itself, Althusser's paradigm case of the mature Marx. Althusser himself, in admirable spirit of honest self-criticism, admitted and pointed this out. In my first essays, I suggested that after the epistemological break of 1845, after this discovery by which Marx founded the science of history, the philosophical categories of alienation and the negation of the negation, among others, disappear. John Lewis replies that this is not true, and he is right. You certainly do find these concepts, directly or indirectly, in the German ideology, in the Guerrilla, two texts which Marx never published, and also, though more rarely, alienation, or much more rarely, negation of the negation, only one explicit appearance, in Capital. Althusser also points out that Marx uses many of these ideas less and less. But this isn't quite right, since as he also points out, there are many references to alienation in the Guerrilla. At some points, Althusser makes a lot out of the fact that the works where terms like alienation appear more frequently are works that Marx never himself published, but this is only partly relevant. He certainly tried to publish some of them, and many of the works that Althusser relies on very heavily, like the German ideology, were never published at all either. In fact, we now know that the German ideology was in fact compiled by later editors, and it's not clear that it was ever written as a single coherent work at all, much less in the form in which Althusser read it. Terrell Carver has written extensively about this. Althusser at times also claims that Marx says there's a complete break between his early and late works, especially between the work up until 1845 and from about 1845 onwards. The problem is that Marx never says anything like this. He says he rejects philosophy various places. He says he really began changing his mind on his way to socialism when, as a young radical democratic journalist, he first came face to face with class struggle. Marx does talk about settling philosophical scores with the people he disagrees with, and talks about devoting himself to political economy and rejecting philosophy. But that's all. He never claims there's a break in his work of anything like the kind that Althusser argues there is, and Althusser never provides a good quote to back this up, which is what you need to do in these cases if you want to prove your point. This doesn't mean that Althusser is wrong to think that there's a break in Marx. It only means that, contra Althusser, Marx never says that there is any such break. Not only does Marx use alienation and its associated concepts in Volume 1 of Capital, he uses it throughout the early drafts and notebooks leading up to it, some proposed additional chapters, and so on. If there was a massive epistemological break between an early Marx, where these ideas were core features, and a later Marx, where they really have no important role, why should Marx keep using them again and again, especially in his own notebooks? Changes in terminology versus changes in ideas. So far, we've looked at changes in terminology and how the evidence Althusser uses doesn't, and he admits it, quite support his conclusion. The same terminology of alienation, etc., carries through to Marx's later works. But we want to look deeper than this. As we saw earlier, Althusser himself points out that we can't and shouldn't look just at individual concepts, but at the broader shifts in one's set of ideas, and here we can find more agreement. We agree with Althusser that the later Marx isn't making arguments about things like shared universal values that all humans agree upon, that he doesn't focus on ethical or normative arguments about what should be the case. This is obvious, since Marx spends most of his later life devoted to scientific research and consciousness raising. As we saw in earlier videos, the later Marx especially says again and again that he isn't talking about justice or morality or ethics. There is also a general shift in terminology in the later works, especially the finished ones. True, alienation and similar words don't disappear, but they get used a lot less. But as Althusser himself said, that's not enough to show that Marx changed his mind about the ideas behind them. And here we think we have something really important to point out. As we've seen in all the previous videos in this series on human development, freedom, alienation, and communism, Marx uses the exact same ideas throughout his earlier and later works. In the videos of this series, we have shown, using Marx's own words, that Marx has the very same core ideas about what human development is, what freedom is and why it's valuable, that and how we are impersonally dominated and therefore unfree under capitalism, and so on. Now, sure, Marx doesn't use the German words that get translated into alienation in English in the 1844 manuscripts very much in his later, especially his published works. But there's an obvious reason for this. It's really unclear what alienation means for Marx when you use two words interchangeably to refer to four different things, i.e. the four different kinds of alienation that Marx distinguishes. As the decades of arguments about what Marx really means in the 1844 manuscripts show, that terminology is really hard to deal with for readers, especially because these manuscripts are written in heavily Hegelian language that of course Marx was fluent in, but that most of us don't grow up with or get trained in before we start reading Marx. After all, it's not uncommon to find different ways of expressing your ideas when writing notes to yourself, as Marx did in the 1844 manuscripts, and when writing stuff you want others to understand. As we've shown in this video, and our videos on human development, freedom, and alienation from product, Marx's ideas on these things run all the way through from the 1844 manuscripts to Capital. Although the terminology changes, the ideas are retained, often with clearer terminology. Let's take just one example here, alienation from product, which we discussed in depth in a previous video. In the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, Marx writes that to the worker, the object labor produces stands opposed to it as something alien, as a power independent of the producer, which begins to confront him as an autonomous power, that the life which he has bestowed on the object confronts him as hostile and alien. As a result of this, the object becomes an alien object that has power over the worker, so that the more the worker produces, the more he falls under the domination of his product, of capital. We must remember here that the product that workers are dominated by, capital, is a social relation, so that workers, on this view, are dominated by capitalist social relations and therefore alienated under them. We can see the exact same idea at work in what Althusser and we agree is the paradigmatic example of Marx's later work, Volume 1 of Capital. In Volume 1 of Capital, Marx writes that under free competition, the immanent laws of capitalist production confront the individual capitalist as a coercive force external to him, and talk about this power of money under capitalism, which is impersonal. Again, the laws of capitalist production are those inherent in capitalist social relations, in capital, and they dominate the workers who are subject to them and to continually produce and reproduce them through their labor. For Althusser, Marx's use of alienation 1844 serves as a merely philosophical category. For us, however, Marx's theory of alienation is very different from anything that Hegel or Feuerbach talk about under the same term. On our reading, alienation for Marx is instead a key part of his diagnosis of specifically capitalist social relations and the kinds of social divisions, activity, and labor that they involve. It doesn't matter whether Marx labels this alienation or not. This isn't about the labels, it's about the ideas, and the ideas here are clearly and obviously the same. For those who are unusually interested in the history of Marxist thought, this shouldn't come as a surprise. Long before either the 1844 manuscripts or the Grundrisse were available, the Hungarian Marxist Georg Lukács, in the essay Reification and the Consciousness of the Proletariat, managed to reconstruct all four kinds of alienation, drawing only on Marx's published works, especially the later ones, like Volume 1 of Capital. He did this, we should note, without having access to the early works like the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 or the Grundrisse at all. And if you can use only Capital and a few other late published works, occasionally some earlier ones that were around, to completely and correctly reconstruct the theory of alienation that Marx uses in the 1844 manuscripts, without having access to them at all, then it's hard to say that the later Marx doesn't have and use these same ideas. How can Althusser, who noted so many important things about Marx's development, fail to notice the continuity of these ideas? One reason, we think, is that he accepted some of the humanists' erroneous readings of the early Marx. If you think that the early Marx believes in some magical, static, ahistorical, and universal human essence, then it's obvious that the later, very historical and contextual Marx must disagree strongly. However, we think that it's wrong to think that the early 1844 Marx holds this kind of view. We can see how this is so by looking at another example we've discussed in a previous video, this time on freedom and human nature. There we saw that in the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844, Marx writes that man makes his life activity itself an object of his will and consciousness. He has conscious life activity. Conscious life activity directly distinguishes man from animal life activity. Only because of that is he a species being. Or, rather, he is a conscious being, i.e. his own life is an object for him only because he is a species being. Only because of that is his activity free activity. Marx says the very same thing in Volume 1 of Capital, writing that we presuppose labor in a form in which it is an exclusively human characteristic. A spider conducts operations which resemble those of the weaver, and the bee would put many a human architect to shame by the construction of its honeycomb cells. But what distinguishes the worst architect from the best of bees is that the architect builds the cell in his mind before he constructs it in the wax. Man not only effects a change of form in the materials of nature, he also realizes his own purposes in those materials. And this is a purpose he is conscious of. Apart from the exertion of the working organs, a purposeful will is required for the entire duration of the work. Marx goes on, also in Volume 1 of Capital, to emphasize the universality of this, writing that such labor is the universal condition for the metabolic interaction between man and nature, the everlasting nature-imposed condition of human existence, and is common to all forms of society in which human beings live. Now, the label of species being isn't the important thing here. Remember, change in terminology doesn't necessarily entail a change in ideas. The important thing here is that for Marx, both in 1844 and in Volume 1 of Capital itself, humans are distinguished from other animals by their powers of consciousness, that this is fundamentally expressed in their activity of labor, and that this is common across all forms of human society. They are not, however, the kind of static and ahistorical things that Marx criticizes Feuerbach for using. Rather, it's a kind of internal capacity that all humans share, which is developed and expressed differently in different contexts and forms of society. It's only possible for all people to fully exercise these powers to govern ourselves in a society that allows it. We saw in another earlier video that Marx thinks, also from 1844 all the way through to Volume 1 of Capital, that this is communism. So in other words, once we properly understand what Marx's early ideas in 1844 at least really were, we can see how they carry through to his very latest works, albeit often with modified terminology that makes them easier to understand. Continuity and discontinuity in Marx's thought. There are many other things that Marx didn't change his mind on after 1844, like his commitment to communism, his rejection of capitalism, feudalism, and slavery, and his commitment to the labor and communist movements. He never wavers in his defense of freedoms of speech, press, conviction, and association. And he remains committed to, among other things, women's emancipation and the importance of equal rights for all humans, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, and so on. This does not, of course, mean that Marx didn't change as he matured and learned more. Of course he did. After 1844 and 1845, he really explored political economy in much greater depth and developed his ideas on political economy much more. Furthermore, he develops a much better and more critical understanding of imperialism and colonialism. He changes his views on the revolutionary potential of non-capitalist societies like Russia. He elaborates his views on history much more, changes and develops his analysis of the state, and even changes his mind on the transition to communism in response to the Paris Commune. He also de-emphasized the normative aspects of his analysis of capitalism. We've seen that he still thinks that capitalism is, for example, unfree, but he doesn't focus his work on arguing for this, but instead focuses on explaining how capitalism in fact works. And he has a reason for doing this. Basically, he doesn't think that criticizing capitalism is going to be very helpful for the working class struggle, replacing it with communism. By contrast, he thinks that understanding and helping others to understand what capitalism is really like and how it really works will help the working classes overthrow capitalism and take us to communism. Since the kind of reading we've defended here is well recognized among Marx experts today, though it's not entirely uncontroversial, but often more controversial on the internet, here's a challenge. If you disagree with us and you'd like to have a conversation about this, please focus on the passages and our interpretation of them and our arguments based on them. If enough things come in, we'll respond in a Q&A video. This marks the end of our first series. Thank you so much for watching. After a Q&A and some response and review videos, our next series will look at Marx's theory of praxis, history, and social change. Have a good summer. Greetings, comrades. Welcome to the Q&A video for our first series on Marx's views on human development, freedom, alienation, and communism. We got a bunch of useful questions in the comments, most of which we tried to answer there. But we thought it would be useful to bring some of the main ones together into one video. Since we didn't get many questions on the videos on impersonal domination and alienation, this Q&A will focus on the questions we got for the videos on human development, freedom, communism, and the video discussing how Althusser's views on the early and late Marx relate to ours. So, let's go through some of the most important questions we got on each video and our answers to them. Part 1. Human development. When Marx thinks that human development is valuable in itself, isn't he making a normative claim that we should maximize human development? Isn't that basically having a conception of morality, or at least justice? Let's do this in 2 steps. First, how is it not a claim about morality? That depends on what you mean by morality. What we think Marx and many others have in mind when they talk about quote-unquote morality is something that's first and foremost about individual behavior, in particular, rules governing good, bad, and permissible, impermissible actions. For example, thou shalt not kill, never lie, etc. We're saying that what Marx thinks is valuable in itself, i.e., not on the basis of or derivable from anything else, is human development, and that he uses this loose and open-ended kind of commitment to evaluate things. This is not the same thing as saying that we ought to maximize human development, or that, for example, one should always follow the maxim, always act so as to maximize the total human development. That would be a claim about morality in the narrower sense, but it's not what we think that Marx is doing. And we think that this misunderstanding is, furthermore, something we tend to do a lot because there's this tendency in our contemporary capitalist society to turn everything into rules or standards that you, the individual, needs to measure up to. For us, it's become very natural to take certain commitments about what is good or valuable, say X is valuable in itself, and turn them into rules and imperatives. Always act so as to maximize X, you ought to maximize X. However, the former kind of thing, human development is valuable in itself, is not the same kind of thing as, and does not entail, the latter kind of thing, that you must or should always act so that you maximize X. For one, the latter first and foremost says something about how an individual person should act, whereas the former does not. Marx, as far as we can tell, never does the latter. He is interested in saying why capitalism has certain shortcomings. It restricts human development relative to what we would now be able to achieve without it. He is not really interested in laying down rules for people to follow, and as such he just isn't very concerned about morality in his and our sense in his political thinking. Now the second part. Why isn't this a claim about justice? That depends on what you mean by justice, which today is typically used in a much broader way than it was in Marx's day. If by justice we mean practically anything to do with normative aspects of society and or politics, then what Marx is talking about definitely counts. But this isn't what we're denying or what we think that Marx is denying when he says that socialism and his arguments for it aren't based on the notion of justice. If, however, you mean something more specific by justice, such as some general principles that tell us how goods ought to be distributed, or which rules should govern individual interactions, then things are a bit different. We try to be really careful with how we phrase this in the human development video, because what Marx is doing is something very different from how lots of us do, and those who went to universities typically are trained to, think about these things. Note first that Marx doesn't say that everyone ought to have equal access to human development. that certainly sounds like a principles of justice of a standard sort, a kind of rule governing the distribution of some good. But that's not what we think that Marx is doing. Marx himself writes that he isn't. For instance, in the critique of the Gotha program, he criticizes German social democrats, many of whom consider themselves Marxists, writing that it was in general a mistake to make a fuss about so-called distribution and put the principal stress on it, because any distribution whatever of the means of consumption is only a consequence of the distribution of the conditions of production themselves. The latter distribution, however, is a feature of the mode of production itself. In fact, Marx goes further to argue that focusing on the distribution of goods and services in political theory, what we today call a focus on distributive justice, is a capitalist confusion that gets in the way of good socialist theory. He writes that vulgar socialism has taken over from the bourgeois economists the consideration and treatment of distribution as independent of the mode of production, and hence the presentation of socialism as turning principally on distribution. After the real relation has long been made clear, why retrogress again? So if he's not doing this, what is Marx doing in his discussion of human development? Marx is taking human development and using it to critically diagnose a problem about capitalism that socialism can and will solve. You can do all of this without having to base it on some rules of justice of the kind that everyone should have equal access to human development, or so on. You can argue, as we think that Marx does, that capitalism is inferior to socialism because it's unfree and therefore restricts human development, without turning human development into a rule-like kind of principle of justice. In the same way, you can compare and evaluate cars according to how fast they drive, or buildings according to how well they keep the rain out, without having to appeal to some rule about, say, what the perfect speed of a car is, or some rule about how fast cars ideally should be. Question: wouldn't Marx's notion of human development always be, or have to be, based on some pre-established yardstick? Different societies typically have different standards for what they consider to be important or essential. A medieval peasant isn't really expected to be able to drive or assemble IKEA furniture, while a modern office worker is rarely expected to be able to harvest barley. First of all, it is possible to tie a conception of human development to various such pre-established yardsticks. So, you can have certain limited, typically highly contextual, conception of human development based on particular yardsticks, say what you, as an ancient Greek or contemporary American, might think of as a desirable kind and degree of human development for the relevant time, place, etc. This, in practice, is what people do in many contexts. However, when Marx values human development, it's not a conception of human development tied to any such particular yardstick. Rather, what he is doing is evaluating certain things based on an open-ended commitment to human development in general. In other words, he is judging certain social arrangements as better or worse based on the way in which they enable and facilitate human development in general. And, as we see in the episodes of freedom,
and to force it to take a long time for regrouping. When the force of the guerrilla band is small, and it is desired above all to detain and slow down the advance of the invading column, groups of snipers fluctuating between 2 and 10 should be distributed all around the column at each of the 4 cardinal points. In this situation, combat can be begun. For example, on the right flank, when the enemy centers his action on that flank and fires on it, shooting will begin at that moment from the left flank, at another moment from the rear guard, or from the vanguard, and so forth. With a very small expenditure of ammunition, it is possible to hold the enemy in check indefinitely. The technique of attacking an enemy convoy or position must be adapted to the conditions of the place chosen for the combat. In general, the first attack on an encircled place should be made during night hours against an advanced post, with surprise assured. A surprise attack carried out by skillful commandos can easily liquidate a position, thanks to the advantage of surprise. For a regular encirclement, the paths of escape can be controlled with a few men, and the roads of access defended with ambushes. These should be distributed in such a way that if one is unsuccessful, it falls back or simply withdraws, while a second remains, and so on successively. In cases where the surprise factor is not present, victory in an attempt to take an encampment will depend on the capacity of the encircling force to detain the attempts of the rescue columns. In these cases, there will usually be support on the enemy's side by artillery, mortars, airplanes, and tanks. In favorable ground, the tank is an arm of small danger. It must travel by roads that are narrow, and is an easy victim of mines. The offensive capacity of these vehicles when in formation is here generally absent or reduced, since they must proceed in Indian file, or at most 2 abreast. The best and surest weapon against the tank is the mine, but in a close fight, which may easily take place in steep places, the Molotov cocktail is an arm of extraordinary value. We will not talk yet of the bazooka, which for the guerrilla force is a decisive weapon, but difficult to acquire, at least in the first stages. Against the mortar, there is the recourse of a trench with a roof. The mortar is an arm of formidable potency when used against an encircled place. But on the other hand, against mobile attackers, it loses its effectiveness, unless it is used in large batteries. Artillery does not have great importance in this type of fight, since it has to be placed in locations of convenient access, and it does not see the targets, which are constantly shifting. Aviation constitutes the principal arm of the oppressor forces, but its power of attack also is much reduced by the fact that its only targets are small trenches, generally hidden. Planes will be able to drop high explosive or napalm bombs, both of which constitute inconveniences rather than true dangers. Besides, as the guerrilla draws as close as possible to the defensive lines of the enemy, it becomes very difficult for planes to attack these points of the vanguard effectively. When encampments with wood or inflammable constructions are attacked, a Molotov cocktail is a very important arm at a short distance. At longer distances, bottles with inflammable material with a fuse lighted can be launched from a 16 caliber shotgun, as described earlier. Of all the possible types of mines, the most effective, although requiring the most technical capacity, is the remotely exploded mine. But contact, fuse, and above all electric mines with their lengths of cord are also extremely useful, and constitute, on mountainous roads, defenses for the popular forces that are virtually invulnerable. A good defense against armored cars along roads is to dig sloping ditches in such a way that the tank enters them easily, and afterwards cannot get out. These can easily be hidden from the enemy, especially at nighttime, or when he has no infantry in advance of the tanks, because of resistance by the guerrilla forces. Another common form of advance by the enemy in zones that are not too steep is in trucks that are more or less open. The columns are headed by armored vehicles, and the infantry follows behind in trucks. Depending upon the force of the guerrilla band, it may be possible to encircle the entire column, following the general rules, or it can be split by attacking some of the trucks and simultaneously exploding mines. It is necessary to act rapidly in this case, seizing the arms of the fallen enemy and retiring. For an attack on open trucks, an arm of great importance, which should be used with all its potential, is the shotgun. The 16 caliber shotgun with large shot can sweep 10 meters, nearly the whole area of the truck, killing some of the occupants, wounding others, and provoking an enormous confusion. Grenades, if they are available, are also excellent weapons for these cases. For all these attacks, surprise is fundamental, because at least at the moment of firing the first shot, it is one of the basic requirements of guerrilla warfare. Surprise is not possible if the peasants of the zone know of the presence of the insurgent army. For this reason, all movements of attack should be made at night. Only men of proven discretion and loyalty can know of these movements and establish the contacts. The march should be made with knapsacks full of food, in order to be able to live 2, 3, or 4 days in the places of ambush. The discretion of the peasant should never be trusted too much. First, because there is a natural tendency to talk and to comment on events with other members of the family, or with friends. And also because of the inevitable cruelty with which the enemy soldiers treat the population after a defeat. terror can be sown, and this terror leads to someone's talking too much, revealing important information in the effort to save his life. In general, the place chosen for an ambush should be located at least 1 day's march from the habitual camp of the guerrilla band, since the enemy will almost always know its location more or less accurately. We said before that the form of fire in a battle indicates the location of the opposing forces. On one side, violent and rapid firing by the soldier of the line, who has the customary abundance of ammunition. On the other side, the methodical, sporadic fire of the guerrilla fighter, who knows the value of every bullet, and who endeavors to expend it with a high degree of economy, never firing one shot more than necessary. It is not reasonable to allow an enemy to escape or to fail to use an ambush to the full in order to save ammunition. But the amount that is to be expended in determined circumstances should be calculated in advance, and the action carried out according to these calculations. Ammunition is the great problem of the guerrilla fighter. Arms can always be obtained. Furthermore, those which are obtained are not expended in guerrilla warfare, while ammunition is expended. Also, generally, it is arms with their ammunition that are captured, and never, or rarely, ammunition only. Each weapon that is taken will have its loads, but it cannot contribute to the others because there are no extras. The tactical principle of saving fire is fundamental in this type of warfare. A guerrilla chief who takes pride in his role will never be careless about withdrawal. This should be timely, rapid, and carried out so as to save all the wounded and the equipment of the guerrilla, its knapsacks, ammunition, etc. The rebels ought never to be surprised while withdrawing, nor can they permit themselves the negligence of becoming surrounded. Therefore, guards must be posted along the chosen road at all places where the enemy army will eventually bring its troops forward in an attempt to close the circle. And there must be a system of communication that will permit rapid reports when a force tries to surround the rebels. In the combat, there must always be some unarmed men. They will recover the guns of companions who are wounded or dead, guns seized in battle or belonging to prisoners. They will take charge of the prisoners, of removing the wounded, and of transmission of messages. Besides, there ought to be a good corps of messengers with iron legs and a proven sense of responsibility, who will give the necessary reports in the least possible time. The number of men needed besides the armed combatants varies, but a general rule is 2 or 3 for each 10, including those who will be present at the scene of the battle, and those who will carry out necessary tasks in the rear guard, keeping watch on the route of withdrawal, and performing the messenger services mentioned above. When a defensive type of war is being fought, that is to say, when the guerrilla band is endeavoring to prohibit the passage of an invasion column beyond a certain point, the action becomes a war of positions. But always at the outset, it should have the factor of surprise. In this case, since trenches, as well as other defensive systems that will be easily observable by the peasants are going to be used, it is necessary that these latter remain in the friendly zone. In this type of warfare, the government generally establishes a blockade of the region, and the peasants who have not fled must go to buy their basic foods at establishments located outside the zones of guerrilla action. Should these persons leave the region at critical moments, such as those we are now describing, this would constitute a serious danger on account of the information that they could eventually supply to the enemy army. The policy of complete isolation must serve as the strategic principle of the guerrilla army in these cases. The defenses and the whole defensive apparatus should be arranged in such a manner that the enemy vanguard will always fall into an ambush. It is very important as a psychological factor that the man in the vanguard will die without escape in every battle, because this produces within the enemy army a growing consciousness of this danger, until the moment arrives when nobody wants to be in the vanguard, and it is obvious that a column with no vanguard cannot move, since somebody has to assume that responsibility. Also, encirclements can be carried out, if these are expedient, or diversionary maneuvers such as flank attacks, or the enemy can simply be detained frontally. In every case, places which are susceptible of being utilized by the enemy for flank attacks should be fortified. We are now assuming that more men and arms are available than in the combats described hitherto. It is evident that the blockade of all possible roads converging into a zone, which may be very numerous, requires a large personnel. The various kinds of traps and attacks against armored vehicles will be increased here, in order to give the greatest security possible to the systems of fixed trenches, which can be located by the enemy. In general, in this type of fight, the order is to defend the positions unto death, if necessary, and it is essential to assure the maximum possibilities of survival to every defender. The more a trench is hidden from distant view, the better. Above all, it is important to give it a cover so that mortar fire will be ineffective. Mortars of 60.1 or 85 millimeters, the usual campaign calibers, cannot penetrate a good roof made with simple materials from the region. This may be made from a base of wood, earth, and rocks covered with some camouflage material. An exit for escape in an extremity must always be constructed, so that the defender may get away with less danger. The lines of fire are something more or less theoretical. They are established at certain critical moments, but they are extremely elastic and permeable on both sides. What does exist is a wide no man's land, but the characteristics of no man's land in guerrilla warfare are that it is inhabited by a civil population, and that this civil population collaborates in a certain measure with either of the two sides, even though in an overwhelming majority with the insurrectional band. These people cannot be removed in mass from the zone on account of their numbers, and because this would create problems of supply for either one of the contenders who try to provide food for so many people. This no man's land is penetrated by periodic incursions, generally during the daytime, by the repressive forces, and at night by the guerrilla forces. The guerrilla forces find there a maintenance base of great importance for their troops. This should be cared for in a political way, always establishing the best possible relations with the peasants and merchants. In this type of warfare, the tasks of those who do not carry arms, of those who are not direct combatants, are extremely important. We have already indicated some of the characteristics of liaison in places of combat, but liaison is an institution throughout the whole guerrilla organization. Liaison out to the most distant command, or out to the most distant group of guerrilla fighters, ought to be linked in such a way that messages will travel from one place to another via the most rapid system available in the region. This holds for regions of easy defense, that is to say, in favorable ground, as well as in unfavorable ground. A guerrilla band operating in unfavorable ground will not be able to use modern systems of communication, such as telephone, roads, etc., except some radios located in military garrisons capable of being defended. If these fall into the hands of the enemy force, it is necessary to change codes and frequencies, a task that is rather troublesome. In all these matters, we are speaking from memory of things that occurred in our war of liberation. The daily and accurate report on all activities of the enemy is complemented with liaison. The system of espionage should be carefully studied, well worked out, and personnel chosen with maximum care. The harm that a counterspy can do is enormous, but even without such an extreme case, the harm that can result from exaggerated information which misjudges the danger is very great. It is not probable that danger will be underrated. The tendency of people in the country is to overrate and exaggerate it. The same magic mentality that makes phantasms and various supernatural beings appear also creates monstrous armies where there is hardly a platoon or an enemy patrol. The spy ought to seem as neutral as possible, not known by the enemy to have any connection with the forces of liberation. This is not as difficult a task as it appears. Many such persons are found in the course of the war. Businessmen, professional men, and even clergymen can lend their help in this type of task and give timely information. One of the most important characteristics of guerrilla warfare is the notable difference between the information that reaches the rebel forces and the information possessed by the enemy. While the latter must operate in regions that are absolutely hostile, finding sullen silence on the part of the peasants, the rebels have in nearly every house a friend or even a relative, and news is passed about constantly through the liaison system until it reaches the central command of the guerrilla force, or of the guerrilla group that is in the zone. When an enemy penetration occurs in territory that has become openly pro-guerrilla, where all the peasants respond to the calls of the people, a serious problem is created. The majority of peasants try to escape with the popular army, abandoning their children and their work. Others even carry the whole family. Some wait upon events. The most serious problem that an enemy penetration into guerrilla territory can provoke is that of a group of families finding themselves in a tight, at times desperate situation. Maximum help should be given to them, but they must be warned of the troubles that can follow upon a flight into hospitable zones so far from their habitual places of livelihood, exposed to the hardships that usually befall in such cases. It is not possible to describe any pattern of repression on the part of the enemies of the people. Although the general methods of repression are always the same, the enemies of the people act in a more or less intensely criminal fashion according to the specific social, historic, and economic circumstances of each place. There are places where the flight of a man into the guerrilla zone, leaving his family and his house, does not provoke any great reaction. There are others where this is enough to provoke the burning or seizure of his belongings, and still others where the flight will bring death to all members of his family. Adequate distribution and organization of the peasants who are going to be affected by an enemy advance must, of course, be arranged according to the habits that prevail in the war zone or country concerned. Obviously, preparations must be made to expel the enemy from such territory by moving against his supplies, completely cutting his lines of communication, destroying by means of small guerrilla bands his attempts to supply himself, and in general forcing him to devote large quantities of men to his supply problem. In all these combat situations, a very important factor is the correct utilization of reserves wherever battle begins. The guerrilla army, because of its characteristics, can rarely count on reserves, since it always strikes in such a way that the efforts of every individual are regulated and employed at something. Nevertheless, despite these characteristics, it should have at some place men ready to respond to an unforeseen development, to detain a counteroffensive, or to take care of a situation at any moment. Within the organization of the guerrilla band, assuming that the conditions and possibilities of the moment permit, a utility platoon can be held in readiness, a platoon that should always go to the places of greatest danger. It can be christened the suicide platoon, or something similar. This title in reality indicates its functions. This suicide platoon should be in every place where a battle is decided, in the surprise attacks upon the vanguard, in the defense of the most vulnerable and dangerous places. In a word, wherever the enemy threatens to break the stability of the line of fire. It ought to be made up strictly of volunteers. Entrance into this platoon should be regarded almost as a prize for merit. In time, it becomes the favorite group of any guerrilla column, and the guerrilla fighter who wears its insignia enjoys the admiration and respect of all his companions. 5. Beginning, development, and end of a guerrilla war. We have now abundantly defined the nature of guerrilla warfare. Let us next describe the ideal development of such a war from its beginning as arising by a single nucleus on favorable ground. In other words, we are going to theorize once more on the basis of the human experience. At the outset, there is a more or less homogeneous group, with some arms, that devotes itself almost exclusively to hiding in the wildest and most inaccessible places, making little contact with the peasants. It strikes a fortunate blow, and its fame grows. A few peasants, dispossessed of their land or engaged in a struggle to conserve it, and young idealists of other classes join the nucleus. It acquires greater audacity and starts to operate in inhabited places, making more contact with the people of the zone. It repeats attacks, always fleeing after making them. Suddenly, it engages in combat with some column or other and destroys its vanguard. Men continue to join it. It has increased in number, but its organization remains exactly the same. Its caution diminishes, and it ventures into more populous zones. Later, it sets up temporary camps for several days. It abandons these upon receiving news of the approach of the enemy army, or upon suffering bombardments, or simply upon becoming suspicious that such risks have arisen. The numbers in the guerrilla band increase as work among the masses operates to make of each peasant an enthusiast for the war of liberation. Finally, an inaccessible place is chosen. A settled life is initiated, and the first small industries begin to be established. A shoe factory, a cigar and cigarette factory, a clothing factory, an arms factory, a bakery, hospitals, possibly a radio transmitter, a printing press, etc. The guerrilla band now has an organization, a new structure. It is the head of a large movement with all the characteristics of a small government. A court is established for the administration of justice. Possibly laws are promulgated, and the work of the indoctrination of the peasant masses continues, extended also to workers, if there are any near, to draw them to the cause. An enemy action is launched and defeated. The number of rifles increases. With these, the number of men fighting with the guerrilla band increases. A moment arrives when its radius of action will not have increased in the same proportion as its personnel. At that moment, a force of appropriate size is separated, a column or a platoon perhaps, and this goes to another place of combat. The work of this second group will begin with somewhat different characteristics because of the experience that it brings, and because of the influences of the troops of liberation on the war zone. The original nucleus also continues to grow. It has now received substantial support in food, sometimes in guns, from various places. Men continue to arrive. The administration of governments, with the promulgation of laws, continues. Schools are established, permitting the indoctrination and training of recruits. The leaders learn steadily as the war develops, and their capacity of command grows under the added responsibilities of the qualitative and quantitative increases in their forces. If there are distant territories, a group departs for them at a certain moment, in order to confirm the advances that have been made, and to continue the cycle. But there will also exist an enemy territory, unfavorable for guerrilla warfare. There, small groups begin to penetrate, assaulting the roads, destroying bridges, planting mines, sowing disquiet. With the ups and downs characteristic of warfare, the movement continues to grow. By this time, the extensive work among the masses makes easy movement of the forces possible in unfavorable territory, and so opens the final stage, which is suburban guerrilla warfare. Sabotage increases considerably in the whole zone. Life is paralyzed. The zone is conquered. The guerrillas then go into other zones, where they fight with the enemy army along defined fronts. By now, heavy arms have been captured, perhaps even some tanks. The fight is more equal. The enemy falls when the process of partial victories becomes transformed into final victories. That is to say, when the enemy is brought to accept battle in conditions imposed by the guerrilla band, there he is annihilated and his surrender compelled. This is a sketch that describes what occurred in the different stages of the Cuban War of Liberation, but it has a content approximating the universe. Nevertheless, it will not always be possible to count on the degree of intimacy with the people, the conditions, and the leadership that existed in our war. It is unnecessary to say that Fidel Castro possesses the high qualities of a fighter and statesman. Our path, our struggle, and our triumph we owe to his vision. We cannot say that without him the victory of the people would not have been achieved, but that victory would certainly have cost much more, and would have been less complete. Chapter 3. Organization of the Guerrilla Front. 1. Supply. A good supply system is of basic importance to the guerrilla hand. A group of men in contact with the soil must live from the products of this soil, and at the same time must see that the livelihood continues of those who provide the supplies, the peasants. Since in the hard guerrilla struggle, it is not possible, above all at the beginning, for the group to dedicate its own energies to producing supplies, not to mention that these supplies would be easily discovered and destroyed by enemy forces in a territory likely to be completely penetrated by the action of repressive columns. Supply in the first stages is always internal. As the guerrilla struggle develops, it will be necessary to arrange supply from outside the limits or territory of the combat. At the beginning, the band lives solely on what the peasants have. It may be possible to reach a store occasionally to buy something, but never possible to have lines of supply, since there is no territory in which to establish them. The line of supply and the store of food are conditioned by the development of the guerrilla struggle. The first task is to gain the absolute confidence of the inhabitants of the zone, and this confidence is won by a positive attitude toward their problems, by help and a constant program of orientation, by the defense of their interests, and the punishment of all who attempt to take advantage of the chaotic moment in which they live in order to use pressure, dispossess the peasants, seize their harvests, etc. The line should be soft and hard at the same time. Soft and with a spontaneous cooperation for all those who honestly sympathize with the revolutionary movement. Hard upon those who are attacking it outright, fomenting dissensions, or simply communicating important information to the enemy army. Little by little the territory will be cleared, and there will then be a greater ease of action. The fundamental principle that ought to prevail is that of paying always for all merchandise taken from a friend. This merchandise can consist of crops or of articles from commercial establishments. Many times they will be donated, but at other times the economic conditions of the peasantry prevent such donations. There are cases in which the necessities of warfare force the band to take needed food from stores without paying for it, simply because there is no money. In such cases, the merchant ought always to be given a bond, a promissory note, something that certifies to the debt, the bonds of hope already described. It is better to use this method only with people who are outside the limits of the liberated territory, and in such cases to pay as soon as possible all or at least a part of the debt. When conditions have improved sufficiently to maintain a territory permanently free from the dominion of the opposing army, it is possible to set up collective plantings where the peasants work the land for the benefit of the guerrilla army. In this way, an adequate food supply of a permanent character is guaranteed. If the number of volunteers for the guerrilla army is much greater than the number of arms, and political circumstances prevent these men from entering zones dominated by the enemy, the rebel army can put them to work directly on the land, harvesting crops. This guarantees supply, and adds something to their record of service looking toward future promotion to the status of combatants. However, it is more advisable that the peasants themselves sow their own crops. This results in work performed more effectively, with more enthusiasm and skill. When conditions have ripened even more, it is possible, depending on the crops involved, to arrange purchases of entire harvests in such a way that they can remain in the field, or in warehouses for the use of the army. When agencies also charged with the duty of supplying the peasant population have been established, all food supplies will be concentrated in these agencies in order to facilitate a system of barter among the peasants, with the guerrilla army serving as intermediary. If conditions continue to improve, taxes can be established. These should be as light as possible, above all for a small producer. It is important to pay attention to every detail of relations between the peasant class and the guerrilla army, which is an emanation of that class. Taxes may be collected in money in some cases, or in the form of a part of the harvest, which will serve to increase the food supplies. Meat is one of the articles of primary necessity. Its production and conservation must be assured. Farms should be established under peasants having no apparent connection with the army. If the zone is not secure, they will devote themselves to the production of chickens, eggs, goats, and pigs, starting with stock that has been bought or confiscated from the large landowners. In the zones of big estates, there are usually large quantities of cattle. These can be killed and salted, and the meat maintained in condition for consumption for a long period of time. This will also produce hides. A leather industry, more or less primitive, can be developed to provide leather for shoes, one of the fundamental accessories in the struggle. In general, necessary foods are the following, depending on the zone: meat, salt, vegetables, starches, or grains. The basic food is always produced by the peasants. It may be malanga, as in the mountainous regions of Orient Province in Cuba. It may be corn, as in the mountainous regions of Mexico, Central America, and Peru. Potatoes, also in Peru. In other zones, such as Argentina, cattle, wheat, and others. But always it is necessary to assure a supply of the fundamental food for the troop, as well as some kinds of fat, which permit better food preparation. These may be animal or vegetable fats. Salt is one of the essential supplies. When the force is near the sea and in contact with it, small dryers should be established immediately. These will assure some production in order always to have a reserve stock and the ability to supply the troops. Remember that in wild places such as these, where only some of the foods are produced, it is easy for the enemy to establish an encirclement that can greatly hurt the flow of supplies to the zone. It is well to provide against such eventualities through peasant organization and civil organizations in general. The inhabitants of the zone should have on hand a minimum food supply that will permit them at least to survive, even though poorly, during the hardest phases of the struggle. An attempt should be made to collect rapidly a good provision of foods that do not decompose, such grains, for example, as corn, wheat, rice, etc., which will last quite a long time. Also flour, salt, sugar, and canned goods of all types. Further, the necessary seeds should be sown. A moment will arrive when all the food problems of the troops in the zone are solved, but large quantities of other products will be needed, leather for shoes, if it has not been possible to create an industry for supplying the zone, cloth and all the accessory items necessary for clothing, paper, a press or mimeograph machine for newspapers, ink, and various other implements. In other words, the need for articles from the outside world will increase in the measure that the guerrilla bands become organized, and the organization becomes more complex. In order for this need to be met adequately, it is necessary that the organized lines of supply function perfectly. These organizations are composed basically of friendly peasants. They should have two poles, one in the guerrilla zone and one in the city. Departing and radiating from the guerrilla zones, lines of supply will penetrate the whole territory, permitting the passage of materials. Little by little, the peasants accustom themselves to the danger. In small groups, they can work marvels, and come to the place the material is needed in the indicated spot without running extreme risks. These movements can be carried out at night with mules, or other similar transport animals, or with trucks, depending on the zone. Thus, a very good supply may be achieved. This type of line of supply is for areas near places of operation. It is also necessary to organize a line of supply from distant areas. These organizations should produce the money needed for making purchases, and also the implements that cannot be produced in small towns or provincial cities. The organization will be nourished with direct donations from sectors sympathetic to the struggle, exchanged for secret bonds, which should be delivered. A strict control over the personnel charged with the management of this operation should always be maintained. Serious consequences should follow any neglect of the indispensable moral requisites involved in this responsibility. Purchases can be made with cash and also with bonds of hope when the guerrilla army, having departed from its base of operations, menaces a new zone. In these cases, there is no way to avoid taking the merchandise from any merchant. He must rely on the good faith and capabilities of the guerrilla armies to make good on his account. For all lines of supply that pass through the country, it is necessary to have a series of houses, terminals, or way stations where supplies may be hidden during the day while waiting to be moved by night. Only those directly in charge of the food supply should know these houses. The least possible number of inhabitants should know about this transport operation, and these should be persons in whom the organization has the greatest confidence. The mule is one of the most useful animals for these tasks. With an incredible resistance to fatigue and a capacity to walk in the hilliest zones, the mule can carry more than 100 kilograms on its back for many days. The simplicity of its food needs always make it an ideal means of transport. The mule train should be well supplied with shoes. The muleteers should understand their animals and take the best possible care of them. In this way, it is possible to have regular four-footed armies with an unbelievable utility. But frequently, despite the strength of the animal and its capacity to bear up through the hardest days, difficulty of passage will make it necessary to leave the cargo in fixed sites. In order to avoid this necessity, there should be a team charged with making trails for this class of animals. If all these conditions are met, if an adequate organization is created, and if the rebel army maintains excellent relations as needed with the peasants, an effective and lasting supply for the whole troop is guaranteed. 2. Civil organization. The civil organization of the insurrectional movement is very important on both fronts, the external and the internal. Naturally, these two have characteristics that are as different as their functions, though they both perform tasks that fall under the same name. The collections that can be carried out on the external front, for example, are not the same as those which can take place on the internal front. neither are the propaganda and the supply. Let us describe first the tasks on the internal front. Here we are dealing with a place dominated, relatively speaking, by the forces of liberation. Also, it is to be supposed that the zone is adapted to guerrilla warfare, because when these conditions do not exist, when the guerrilla fighting is taking place in poorly adapted terrain, the guerrilla organization increases in extension, but not in depth. It embraces new places, but it cannot arrive at the internal organization, since the whole zone is penetrated by the enemy. On the internal front, we can have a series of organizations which perform specific functions for more efficiency in administration. In general, propaganda belongs directly to the army, but it also can be separated from the army if kept under its control. This point is so important that we will treat it separately. Collections are a function of the civil organization, as are the general tasks of organizing the peasants and workers, if these are present. One council should govern both of these classes. Raising supplies, as we explained in a previous chapter, can be carried out in various ways, through direct or indirect taxes, through direct or indirect donations, and through confiscations. All this goes to make up the large chapter on supplies for the guerrilla army. Keep in mind that the zone ought by no means to be impoverished by the direct action of the rebel army, even though the latter will be responsible indirectly for the impoverishment that results from enemy encirclement, a fact that the adversary's propaganda will repeatedly point out. Precisely for this reason, conflicts ought not to be created by direct causes. There ought not be, for example, any regulations that prevent the farmers of a zone in liberated territory from selling their products outside that territory, save in extreme and transitory circumstances, and with a full explanation of these interruptions to the peasantry. Every act of the guerrilla army ought always to be accompanied by the propaganda necessary to explain the reason for it. These reasons will generally be well understood by the peasantry that has sons, fathers, brothers, or relations within this army, which is therefore something of their own. In view of the importance of relations with the peasants, it is necessary to create organizations that make regulations for them, organizations that exist not only within the liberated area, but also have connections in the adjacent areas. Precisely through these connections, it is possible to penetrate a zone for a future enlargement of the guerrilla front. The peasants will sow the seed with oral and written propaganda, with accounts of life in the other zone, of the laws that have already been issued for the protection of the small peasant, of the spirit of sacrifice of the rebel army. In a word, they are creating the necessary atmosphere for helping the rebel troops. The peasant organization should also have connections of some type that will permit the channeling and sale of crops by the rebel army agencies in enemy territory through intermediaries, more or less benevolent, more or less friendly to the peasant class. Joined with a devotion to the cause which brings the merchant to defy dangers in such cases, there also exists the devotion to money that leads him to take advantage of the opportunity to gain profits. We have already spoken in connection with supply problems of the importance of the Department of Road Construction. When the guerrilla band has achieved a certain level of development, it no longer wanders about through diverse regions